Good morning, everybody. Hello, and welcome to this morning's launch of the ESRI's research report on the role of misperceptions in attitudes to immigration. And that's undertaken by our team of researchers here, Shane Timmons, Celine Fox, Evan Karen Key, Kira Murphy, and Pete Lunn. And this is a really fascinating new report on public awareness of key immigration facts and how these perceptions relate to attitudes towards immigration. The work is part of a sort of long running research program in examining migration, integration, and equality that's supported by the Department of Justice, Home Affairs, and Migration. And we'd like to thank them all for their input. In a moment, I'll hand over to Zara Lafferty from the department to give some introductory remarks and officially launch the report. Then Dr. Shane Timmons will take us through the research and the key findings. We can then take some questions from attendees if you'd like to pop those in the Q&A function as we go along. But to get us started, I'll hand over to Zara. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martina, and thanks to Shane Timmons and colleagues for a very insightful report. This report is incredibly valuable work, which adds to the ongoing high-quality evidence base produced by the ESRI, continually building understanding about the complex issues associated with migration and integration in Ireland. So over 20% of our neighbours, friends, and co-workers were born outside of Ireland, and we know that Ireland benefits from migration. So while we work to strengthen immigration processes and ensure a fair, rules-based system is supported, we need to ensure that we continue to recognise the benefits of migration. And part of that work is ensuring that we have a well-informed policy environment and a well-informed public and society. So the benefits from migration are significant. While we've always seen migration to and from Ireland, growth in recent years has coincided with changing perceptions. And this research shows some concerning misperceptions. We are currently near full employment, and many services or sectors are finding it hard to fill roles. About 1 in 5 workers in Ireland were born abroad. So people, they're coming to Ireland, they're helping to fill these roles, they're bringing skills, and they're supporting our economic growth. The significant increase in the number of non-Irish people employed here over the past 10 years has also helped Ireland as a whole to recover from global financial crisis and to become wealthier and more productive. This research helps us to understand where we can focus attention for improved information and understanding, while showing yet again that migrants make an extremely strong contribution and are welcomed by the vast majority of Irish people. The research shows that the potential causes of misperceptions evidenced in this report are complex. While sharing facts and evidence-based public information are of value, the research backs up what we all instinctively know, and that's that sharing facts is not always effective. What influences people's attitudes and knowledge also includes the level and nature of contact and social interaction that people have with people from a migrant background, as well as people's education and values or beliefs. This means that supporting integration is very important in addressing these misperceptions. My department is currently working on a national migration and integration strategy that will set out how this government intends to meet the opportunities and demands facing our society and economy over the next decade. The department also administers a series of funds to support anti-racism and integration initiatives around the country, including the National Integration Fund, the Ireland Against Racism Fund, and the EU's Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund. And the Programme for Government also commits to implementing the EU Migration and Asylum Pact through a new International Protection Act. And much of the public focus on the pact has been focused on those aspects related to reception conditions and assessment procedures for people arriving seeking international protection. However, an important part of a well-managed and effective asylum and migration policy is having an effective integration and inclusion policy in place, which is why we're committed to publishing the new strategy and supporting local communities' efforts across Ireland. And as well as this important focus on integration, we are also continuing to progress work on improved community engagement and communications on migration. So this work began in 2024 and was supported by a range of government departments and included development of a trusted source of facts and information on migration, which can be found on gov.ie/migration. And the goal of this work is to make it easier for people to find the facts about information and to understand how our immigration system works. So immigration is complex and it can be difficult to know where to go to find reliable information. So this campaign aimed to share verified information so that people are better informed to take part in the many conversations that are happening around the country on immigration. And advice is also given on misinformation and disinformation so people can know how to sense check what they see or read online, and they can report false or inaccurate content that they see on most social media platforms. As well as this, there was a paid information campaign at the end of 2024, which reached over 2 million people in Ireland and was promoted on social media platforms and other online channels. So the migration and integration topics covered throughout the campaign were selected based on feedback from local communities and representatives, research, and consultation with key stakeholders in government departments. So that engagement and consultation work will be further progressed this year. So there will be community engagement sessions being continued by our department in each county in Ireland. And the purpose of these sessions will be to hear people's views and to feed into the development of the new migration and integration strategy. So I suppose just to conclude, I think it's important to recognize that there have been efforts to cause division in society, but it's also important to remember that these efforts come from a vocal minority and do not represent the broader public attitudes towards migration. And that Ireland continues to welcome people who want to come here to work and to contribute to our society. So thank you again to Shane and colleagues for a fantastic report. And I'll hand over to Shane now to present the report. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm going to share slides here. And good morning, everyone. Great to see so much interest in the report today. I'm going to presume my slides are sharing, but if not, maybe one of the co-panelists can let me know. I'm not going to spend too much time trying to motivate this report. So if you've joined this call, you obviously have an interest in how the public think about immigration. There's obviously been increased attention to it in recent years, and in particular to some of the challenges it can pose, and also increased attention to public sentiment about immigration. So our aim with this report is to try to provide some evidence on how the public are thinking about the issue, to try to inform public discourse and policy. Before I get into it, there are some things that I want to make clear from the outset. So this report is about public perceptions of key immigration facts and statistics, but we didn't at the outset expect individuals to know precisely these statistics. Instead, we were interested in what their intuitions are about these facts. So we asked them to make their best guess for the different facts that I'm going to talk about today. And in particular, we were interested in whether there are biases in these guesses or these intuitions that they have, and especially then if those intuitions are related to their attitudes. So I want to make that clear from the outset. I also want to stress that attitudes are complex. So as a psychologist by training, we don't necessarily kind of view attitudes as something that is straightforward, or that might be just simply caused by a misperception. It is very difficult to identify exactly what is causing an attitude. And attitudes don't always lead directly to behavior. So when I kind of make it clear from the outset that we're not trying to claim today that any misperceptions that we identify might be the direct cause of some kind of problematic issues that we've seen over the last while, and in particular kind of related to the increase in hate crimes against on the basis of race and nationality and so on. And then the final point I want to make before I get into what we did and found is that these perceptions of reality are going to matter. So firstly, if people hold kind of misperceptions, that can distort democratic debate. So you might have two people who are debating in good faith about a topic, but if their starting point is coming from a kind of misperception, that's going to lead to problems in terms of resolving their differences. Misperceptions also leave people open to misinformation. So if I hold a misperception of a specific group and then I'm presented with misinformation, I might be more likely to accept that or not question the nature of that misinformation if it confirms this belief that I already have, particularly if that's based on a misperception. And then finally, obviously, there's the potential for these misperceptions to generate or kind of make social tensions worse. So with those kind of clarifications out of the way, I'm going to get briefly into some of the relevant evidence for this report. A lot of it comes from colleagues at the ESRI. So, for example, from the monitoring report on integration. So, the most recent one highlights how migrants tend to have higher employment rates than the Irish-born population, and they're more likely to hold third-level qualifications. But they tend to earn less and are more likely to be at risk of poverty and are more likely to experience enforced deprivation. And a lot of that is linked to housing precarity. So, migrants much more likely to be reliant on the private rental market, for example. We also know from further reports published as part of this research program funded by the department that most people, as Zara said, hold fairly or very positive attitudes to immigration. Attitudes, at least when they were most recently measured, much higher than in the previous decade in Ireland, and also higher compared to, or more positive compared to most other EU countries. Going to get touch very, very briefly on some academic theory. This is relevant for these reports and for what I'm going to talk about today. But one of the kind of primary theories used to kind of inform how we think about negative attitudes towards migrants is intergroup threat theory. And that proposes that negative attitudes arise when people perceive migrants as a threat, either to their kind of economic resources, to cultural values, or to physical safety. And on the economic resources side of things, there is some existing evidence supporting this idea. So, for example, the report that we have on screen there on attitudes towards immigration shows that subjective feeling of financial strain, so feeling that it's difficult to make ends meet, matters for people's attitude. So that predicts holding a more negative attitude, as well as kind of having a general distrust of others. Those kinds of psychological characteristics are associated with more negative attitudes towards immigration. We also know that recent increases in the share of migrants in communities is associated with more negative attitudes, but that is primarily driven by economically disadvantaged areas. So we're kind of seeing that idea of kind of perhaps perceived competition for economic resources being linked with negative attitudes. And then what I want to highlight here, which kind of really motivates the report I'm going to present today, is that intergroup threat theory isn't necessarily referring to the reality, but people's perceptions of that threat. So there doesn't necessarily need to be competition between migrants and the sort of native population for economic resources. But if there's a perception of that competition, that might be then linked to negative attitudes. So that leads us to our our research questions for this report, which were how do the public perceive the size of the migrant population, their reasons for migration, as well as their characteristics. And we look at things like people's perceptions of recent migration for international protection versus employment, for example, as well as employment rates, education levels, social housing uptake, and prison population. And then, secondly, and very importantly for us in this report, is whether those misperceptions are linked with attitudes. Okay, so I'm going to get briefly into the method. So we recruited a nationally representative sample of 1,200 adults to take part in the online experimental survey. Going to spend a bit of time talking about the steps we took to try to reduce bias and to kind of make our estimates as accurate as possible. I'm going to have to indulge me a little bit here on this, so it's an important issue for us. So firstly, online, we ran the study online rather than through phone or in person. So the idea here is that we would reduce social desirability bias in attitudes. So it's as anonymous as we can get it, meaning that people are less likely to kind of say that they might have a positive attitude towards immigration just because they think that's what the interviewer wants to hear. Importantly, the invitation email to take part in the study was neutrally worded. So people took part in the study as one about issues facing Irish society. We had no mention of immigration in it. And what that does is it means that we're not attracting people with strong views either way into the study. We also measured attitudes before the topic was revealed. So I'll explain a little bit more about this shortly. But the first question that we asked people was what they thought the main issues facing the country was, and this is before they knew that the study itself was about immigration. Obviously, if they had previously answered questions about immigration, then we asked them about the main issues facing the country. They might be then primed to report something like immigration as being an issue. And with that, we had very careful consideration of the question order. So, as I said, the first question we presented people was on the main issues that they think Ireland is facing. We then presented people with a series of modules with different questions in it, and we presented them in random order. So, some questions about their general outlook. So, for example, how much they trust others, as well as their kind of optimism for the future, and so on. So, anything that previous research had showed us was important for people's attitudes to immigration. We had another module on policy attitudes, of which one of the questions was about immigration. So it was embedded in a larger list to avoid people kind of focusing primarily on that immigration question and that possibly distorting or biasing the response. And then we also measured household finances, both using kind of more objective measures like income as well as how they feel about their finances. And then all of this was done before we measured people's perceptions of immigration. So that means we know that these perceptions, it's not the fact that we asked about these perceptions then biasing people's attitudes towards the policies. Then the questions that we asked to measure the perceptions, we designed those using best evidence that we could from numerical cognition research. And essentially, that's the psychology of how people think about numbers. We asked the questions in a way to make it as easy as possible. Naturally, if you're asking people about statistics, you don't want your results to be biased by the level of numeracy that those individuals might have. So I'll show you an example of the kinds of questions we asked shortly. And then we also varied the kinds of questions that we asked. So we changed the framing of them to ensure that that wasn't driving any of the results that we have. So there's me indulging in our multiple steps that we take to reduce bias within the survey measures themselves so that we can be more confident then of the robustness of the data that we're generating. Okay, so just very quickly here on the kinds of questions that people saw. So this is the very first question. You'll see the first section is about society in general. What do you think are the three most important issues facing Ireland at the moment? And they were open text boxes that people input. So they weren't selecting anything from a list. We were getting people to report the issues that kind of spontaneously came to them when completing the survey. Here's an example of questions for general outlook that might have come next for someone. So in general, how pessimistic or optimistic are you about the future? How trustworthy do you think other people are? We had questions about household finances. So that question there, which we in previous research was found to be related to attitudes, how easy or difficult is it for you to make ends meet? How do you think you compare to other groups of people in terms of the people who are most well off and the people that you think are least well off? And here's the list of policies that we presented with people. Now, we weren't necessarily interested in responses to any of these questions other than the fourth item down on the list. So you'll see there that there's a question, how positively or negatively do you feel about immigration of people from outside the EU or EEA for work, education, or family reasons? That was one of our attitude questions. Other people saw immigration for international protection reasons. But as you can see with that list, that item about immigration doesn't necessarily stand out. So in that way, we're reducing the risk that people are going to essentially specifically attend to that issue of immigration, and that's going to bias the responses that they give. Next on screen then is how we elicited the people's perceptions of the key immigration facts. So we use essentially, we elicit what are called natural frequencies. So how many in 100 adults rather than trying to elicit percentages. Again, this is to try to make things as accurate as possible and for the question to be as easy as possible for people. So the picture below shows 100 adults. Imagine this represents all of the adults in Ireland. Out of every 100 adults living in Ireland, what is your best guess for how many were born abroad? So that's our definition here for migrant. We told people that we didn't expect them to know the answer, but to give their best guess. So you could highlight a number of individuals on the screen. You were told how many you had selected. You confirmed your choice, and then the question moved on. Some of the questions then were direct follow-on questions. So, for example, here you've said that 28 in every 100 adults were born outside of Ireland. What is your best guess for how many were born outside of Ireland, who were born outside of Ireland were born outside of the UK, EU, and North America? And that question was informed by a pilot study that we run. So you could select your subset from that and then move on. So we did that for multiple different statistics, and now I'll get into the part of the webinar which I guess most people have tuned in for, which is the results. So firstly, on that first question I showed, out of every 100 adults living in Ireland, what is your best guess for how many were born abroad? We know from the official statistics that it's in the range of 19 to 22%. So the 22% there would be the kind of the highest official estimate that we had at the time of the study. And we group people into different categories depending on the response they gave. So we had about 22% of people there underestimated the share of the population born abroad. We had another 22% or so who we judge as being reasonably accurate. So they gave a guess between that 17 and 24% range as being reasonably accurate. But the largest group overestimated the share of the population born abroad. And we can split those into groups who overestimated by a bit, so up to 40%, that was 38% of the population, and those who then gave very large overestimates. So it was a further 18% of people gave a very large overestimate. And what's important to flag here is that we'd previously run a pilot study to figure out what kinds of questions that we would ask, and in that we determined that most people, when they think about immigration, they think about countries like Ukraine, like Nigeria, and so on. So countries that people tend to associate with international protection, rather than countries that actually constitute most of the migrants in Ireland. So countries in the EU and the UK, for example. But what we're seeing here is a pretty large overestimate of the population born abroad. Similarly, if we look at the estimates for what is your best guess for how many were born outside of the EU, UK, North America, we see some people underestimated. So 16% of the population gave an underestimate. About a third of people were reasonably accurate. So the official statistics giving us a range around 8%. So we allow kind of 5 to 11% there as a reasonably accurate estimate. But again, the largest group overestimated, and we can split those into the people who overestimated by a bit, so 12 to 19%, and the people who overestimated by a lot. So over 20% of the population was guessed by 22% of people. I'm conscious lots of percentages being thrown at people with this. Um, so again, we're seeing large overestimates. The other way that you could look at this is that we didn't want to necessarily say, okay, if you have overestimated the proportion of the population born abroad, that might then carry into your overestimate of the population born outside the EU, UK, North America. But you can treat it as, okay, if we instead convert it to the share of migrants you believe here to be born outside of the EU, UK, North America, we still see that same overestimate. The second kind of group of statistics that we were interested in, or the group of facts that we were interested in, were the people's estimates for the reasons people have come to Ireland. So for this, we asked people about residence applications since 2022, so since the invasion of Ukraine. And we asked people to guess how many people who have applied for residence since 2022 applied for various reasons. What was quite interesting for us is that people were pretty spot on when it came to their estimate of residence applications from Ukraine. So the average guess was 29%, where the official estimate is 28%. So we're seeing some of that kind of wisdom of crowds coming through for the Ukraine measure, but not to other measures in this set of questions. So when asked about international protection for other reasons, the average guess was about 18%, whereas the official figure is about 11.5. So quite a large overestimate there. But the largest discrepancy, or the largest misperception that we observed, came for the work or education. So since 2022, about 46% of those who've applied for a residency in Ireland did so for work or education reasons, whereas the public guessed it to be 19%. And prior to 2022, the official estimate would have been higher again. So really a large underestimate of the work or education reasons. We also saw a pretty large overestimate of immigration for family reasons. And then other reasons was anything then that was left over. So I won't go through all of the charts that we had in the report. There's a summary table at the beginning of the report, so the executive summary that kind of details the official estimates against the guesses that participant gave. So these are the ones that I've just shown. We also asked people about the employment rate, both for those for the population born in Ireland as well as the population born outside of Ireland. There we saw that participants were reasonably accurate when it came to their guess for people born in Ireland. So they guessed around 68%, the official figure being about 73%, but they strongly underestimated the employment rate for migrants. So they guessed 52%, whereas the official estimate is around 77%. So quite a large underestimate there of the employment rate for migrants. You'll also notice that participants assumed that the employment rate for people born in Ireland is higher than the employment rate born outside of Ireland, but in reality, the opposite is the case. And that's a similar effect we see when we look at tertiary education. So, what proportion of the population do you think has third level education? Again, people were reasonably accurate when it came to their estimate of the Irish-born population. So, we have 42% against 44%, but they underestimated tertiary education levels among migrants. So, the official estimate being about 59% there, whereas people guessed it was down at 34%. We also asked about social housing uptake. This is quite an interesting one you'll see with the scale of the discrepancy. So people guessed that over a third of the Irish population live in social housing, whereas the official estimate is 9%. Whereas they also guessed then 44% of the migrant-born population living in social housing, and the official estimate being 6%. We have looked into other possible kind of interpretations people might have had of the social housing uptake question, but nothing really gets you close to the to that scale of misperception overall. It is consistent with international evidence that people tend to overestimate welfare uptake in some countries. But what's important here is that you'll see again that people tend to people's estimates for the Irish-born social housing uptake rate is lower than the migrant-born one, whereas in reality the opposite is the case. And then lastly, for a group of stats that we have the proportion of the prison population. So participants underestimated the proportion of the prison population who are Irish. And then the flip side of that would be them overestimating the proportion that are non-Irish. And in particular, they overestimate the proportion of the prison population who are non-EU, UK, or North American. So in reality, it's about 8%, which would be representative of the population, whereas people guessed it to be around 19% of the population. So they think that non-EU, UK, or North Americans are overrepresented in the prison population when that is not the case in reality. One final note on the statistics or on the people's perceptions is I mentioned that we altered the framing of some questions, and so what I mean by that is that some people were randomized to see a question where they estimated the proportion of the population born outside the UK, EU, or North America, whereas other people were randomized to see a question asking them about people born in the UK, EU, or North America. Logically, obviously, these should give you equivalent estimates for how many people people assume are born outside of these countries. But what we see is a very strong framing effect. So if we look at the implied guess for those born outside the UK, EU, or North America, for those who saw that outside frame, it was about 19% of the population, whereas those who saw the inside frame, the implied estimate they give is actually about 12%. From a psychological perspective, this one is quite interesting because it kind of gives some insight possibly into what might be causing misperceptions. So what we see here is that when people's attention is drawn to specific groups of migrants, they tend to think that this group is larger than it is. What's important to note here, though, is that even if we take that lower estimate, so the 12%, that is still people kind of significantly overestimating the size of that migrant population. So the overestimate or the misperception that we see can't be fully explained by drawing people's attention to specific groups, but it seems to play a role in that overestimate. Okay, moving on to attitudes. So we measured attitudes in a couple of different ways, as I mentioned. So one was on a straightforward rating scale. And as I said, people either were asked a question about immigration from people outside the EU for work, education, or family reasons, or for international protection. So this is the distribution we get for work, education, or family reasons. Along the bottom of this chart, we have the rating that people gave. So one being very negative, seven being very positive, and then it's a percentage of people who gave the different ratings. So you can see the most common response there, 26% of people reporting that they feel pretty neutrally about it. But then 13% of people there giving a very negative response for immigration for work, education, or family reasons. Ratings for international protection are quite are a bit more negative. So you can see that the kind of the large difference there coming out on the one being very negative. So 22% of the population they're saying that they feel very negatively about immigration from outside the EU for international protection reasons. Broadly, however, this chart, so particularly on the work or education or family reasons, this is consistent with other surveys that have been done on the level of kind of attitudes towards immigration. For this particular report, we selected the ratings that we thought might perhaps generate more negative sentiment. So, for example, outside of the EU and for international protection reasons, to see where misperceptions linked to those attitudes. And the other way, and perhaps a more telling way of getting at people's attitudes for immigration, is that open text question about the three most important issues facing Ireland at the moment. So in this question, people could input any text entry they wanted into those three boxes. We then coded them, so there's no pre-select list. These are the things that are coming through from the population spontaneously. What we see here is that, unsurprisingly, housing comes out as the most commonly cited issue facing the country. So that's over 80% of the population citing housing. This is followed by cost of living and health, with just over 40% of the population citing those two as issues. Immigration follows at 28% of the population citing immigration spontaneously as an issue or one of the main issues facing the country. What's also kind of interesting to note here is that we had 12% of the population cite anti-immigrant sentiment or something along those lines as one of the main issues facing the country. To the best of our knowledge, this is the first time this has been detected in one of these surveys. So, one of the question of this style. So, we had previously ourselves run a very similar question during the pandemic, and there was no reference to anti-immigrant sentiment during that survey, and we also haven't been able to find it in other ones. So, this is something that seems to have emerged quite recently as a concern among the public. Not clearly not as high as those who are citing immigration as an issue, but an interesting observation. Okay, so I'm going to get into some more technical charts for now, and this is to try to explain the link between attitudes and misperceptions. So bear with me for this one. What I'm going to show you here on the bottom of the chart is the participants' guess for the size of the migrant population. So what proportion of the population they think were born abroad. And then along the side on the y-axis, we have what the model predicts to be their attitude towards immigration. So it's on that 1 to 7 scale, but the chart itself is truncated slightly here. The important thing that I want to draw your attention to here, so there's a couple of them. One is that you can see as the migrant population guess size increases, so as it goes up towards 50, attitudes decrease. And if I highlight here in green, so the overlap of these green rectangles here, that shows where attitudes are when the migrant population guess size is reasonably accurate. So I should highlight that this is the non-EU migrant population guess size. So you can see that where that guess is reasonably accurate, people tend to give it around a 4 on the scale. So they're not reporting a negative attitude towards immigration. Going to show a similar chart here. This is looking at the percentage of applications for work or education as a reason for residence in Ireland. So here you can see that as people's guess for the percentage of recent applications for work or education increases, their attitude towards immigration is more positive. So again, if I do that green overlap looking at, okay, where are the estimates most accurate? We see here that at the most accurate level, the rating is 4.5, so verging on that positive side of the scale. And then one final one for these charts. So if we look at people's guess for recent residence applications for international protection, again, you can see here as that percentage guess increases, people's attitude becomes more negative. And looking at the overlap there where attitudes are most positive, where people are accurate in their guess for international protection, the proportion of applications for international protection, again, it's about the midpoint of the scale on attitudes. So they're not displaying negative attitudes, they're not reporting negative attitudes towards immigration. I'm going to try to show this relationship in hopefully more intuitive way. So this chart looks at that attitude rating scale. So from 1 very negative to 7 very positive. What I'm going to show here, first of all, is the distribution on that scale for people who just hold 2 misperceptions. So we looked at the number of misperceptions that the sample held. You could hold in this analysis anywhere between 0 and 7 misperceptions. But say, for example, you overestimate the size of the non-EU population, and then you also underestimate the proportion who are coming here for work, but you're reasonably accurate on other measures. So this is where the model predicts your attitudes to be. So you can see reasonably positive attitudes towards immigration, particularly compared to someone who has more of those misperceptions. So if you misperceive four of our statistics. In particular, you can see there's a large difference there on the very negative attitude, where those who hold four misperceptions are 57% more likely to feel very negatively about immigration compared to those who just hold two misperceptions. Essentially, what this chart is showing is that the more misperceptions you hold, the more negative your attitude is towards immigration. And another way to look at this is to look at your misperception score. So that's along the bottom of the chart on the x-axis, and how likely you are to cite immigration as a national issue. So what we see here is that the more of these misperceptions you hold, the more likely it is you're going to say that immigration is a national issue, or one of the main issues facing the country. So if we look, for example, at the difference between not holding any of these misperceptions and holding four of them, so say someone who consistently overestimates the size of the migrant population, they overestimate the size of the population from outside the EU, they underestimate the employment rate, and they also overestimate applications for international protection, they're twice as likely to view immigration as a main issue facing the country compared to someone who is reasonably accurate on those facts. And then final chart from me before I get into a summary is how these perceptions relate to other known predictors of attitudes. So these are all issues that and concepts that we measured as part of the survey. One of them that came out as significantly predictive of attitudes was your experience of material deprivation. So going without, for example, clothing, food, heating, and so on, due to an inability to afford them. So if we compare someone who didn't experience deprivation to someone who had to forego two of those basic needs, on average, your attitude was zero point 0.1 lower, 0.1 lower on that scale. We know that trust in others matters. So if we compare someone with the average level of trust in others compared to someone with a one standard deviation lower level of trust in others, your attitude is likely to be 0.3 points lower on that attitude scale. And that's a similar effect we see for the difference between people who say that they hold a left-wing orientation versus a right-wing political orientation. And similarly, among people who say that they feel their voice is heard politically, so average versus below average, we see a similar kind of effect there. And these are all significant predictors of attitudes. We can compare these then to our estimates or our misperceptions. So the misperception for born outside the EU, so it's a zero point 0.2. But for international protection, you can see it's up there with the political orientation type measures. But perceived work and education estimates there we see to be really strongly associated with more negative attitudes. So that emerges as kind of one of the strongest predictors. And just a final one to touch on here is on contact. So what we mean by contact is kind of engagement with the migrant population. And we looked at it in two ways. One was the frequency of contact, so how often you say you have contact with someone who you think was born abroad, and secondly was the quality of that. So do you have a close personal connection with someone like a friend, for example, who was born abroad? What we see here is that among those who have a personal connection with someone who was born abroad, more frequent contact is associated with more positive attitudes. But among those who don't have a close personal connection with someone who was born abroad, more frequent contact is actually associated with much more negative attitudes. So that might be the kind of incidental contact day to day, rather than that contact with someone that they've gotten to know. So that's an interesting finding that emerged in some of the analyses. Okay, to summarize to summarize these findings, so we see that misperceptions about the facts of immigration are widespread. They appear to be systematically biased and strongly associated with negative attitudes. What's kind of interesting here, you might be puzzled to see or puzzled why there's now a picture of a sweet jar on screen. Typically, when we try to measure people's estimates or perceptions of facts or statistics like these, what you'll get is a kind of wisdom of crowd effects, where the average is going to produce a reasonably accurate estimate. And we saw that with, for example, estimates of Ukraine. We also saw with estimates of the Irish employment rate and the Irish tertiary education level. But that only works if there's not a bias in place. So if you're ever at a kind of fun fair and you see one of these sweet cherries, the best way to improve your chance of winning is to take an average of everyone else's guess. If you can see the list, take an average of their guesses, and you'll be within a pretty good shot. Unless there's a bias at play, and that seems to be what we're observing here, that people are kind of biased towards a certain kind of thinking about the migrant population. So we see that most people overestimate the number of migrants living in Ireland, and especially the number of migrants from outside of the EU and UK. And their intuitions about migrant characteristics, they skew towards what we see as higher competition for public resources and for criminality. So people underestimate migrant employment and education levels. They also overestimate social housing uptake and proportion of the prison population. And they strongly underestimate recent migration for work and education reasons while overestimating migration for international protection. So all of this is consistent with kind of going in one direction in terms of people's estimates of migration. And importantly, those who hold very negative attitudes towards immigration also tend to hold more of these misperceptions. So again, indicative of a bias there. Do want to stress that the majority do not view immigration as a major issue or feel negatively about it. But then also we see other psychological factors that matter for people's attitudes. So we don't observe an association between income, household income as measured, and attitudes, but we do see that experiencing material deprivation is associated with more negative attitudes, as well as pessimism for the future, less trust in others, belief that one's voice is not heard politically. All of these are significant predictors of negative attitude. Some of that supporting previous work in this research program. And then contact comes out as a complicated predictor. So if it comes with personal connections like friendship, it's associated with more positive attitudes. But without those personal connections, it's associated with more negative ones. And to finish off from me, so some of the implications from this, which I'll take, are not necessarily straightforward. So attitudes are complex and we can't be certain of causality. But widespread misperceptions are going to matter for informed democratic debate. So there's obviously an importance of people having a shared understanding of the facts if we're going to have an informed debate about issues like immigration. And it also means that people might be more susceptible to misinformation. We find evidence that drawing attention to subgroups of migrants or possibly immigration in general, given that finding that people tend not to think of places like the EU or UK when thinking about immigration in general, might be contributing to those misperceptions. So communications that highlight under-recognized facts may be able to help here. Particularly given the finding that not all facts are misperceived. So we see that people are accurate on the percentage of residence applications from Ukraine, accurate on the Irish-born employment and tertiary education levels. And these are, I guess, facts that we have solid data that is regularly shared with the public. It's regularly broadcast. So perhaps it's not too surprising that these are the figures that people were much more accurate on compared to the other things that we measured. We also see the quality of contact with migrants appears to matter, so that lending support to integration programs and the local authority integration teams, improving that quality of contact and not just the incidental contact between people. But broadly, I think these findings are consistent with that intergroup threat theory. So we have people who are perceiving more competition for economic resources tend to be the people who have more negative attitudes towards immigration. So what this possibly implies then is that social policies to reduce deprivation and encourage more economic and political inclusion are likely to have co-benefits then for social cohesion. So there's obviously I've gone through a lot there. There's a lot more in the report, but happy to open it up to the Q&A now. I can't see anyone, but I'm going to presume that people are still listening.
Thanks
Thanks
very
very
much.
much.
Thanks, Shane. And no, you've got a number of questions coming in here. One linked to that final point you made in terms of contact, but specifically in relation to applicants for international protection and international protection centres, is somebody making the point that talking to local residents about concerns and having people involved and introducing them seem to have in that particular instance made that integration a lot kind of more straightforward. So that's more a comment than a question. Couple of questions coming in on the demographic criteria and the representativeness of the actual sample, and
Mhm.
in particular on the percentage of maybe this is a subsidiary question, the percentage of the respondents themselves who were born outside Ireland, and if the responses varied by their own place of birth.
Yeah, so very good question. When running these services, we work with market research agencies. So in this case, we worked with both Red Sea and Ipsos B&A, and we didn't want to sample just from one panel in case there were biases within. So we pooled two panels for this, and we set the criteria to be representative by age, gender, region, and what market researchers call social grade, which essentially is a kind of proxy for socioeconomic status. Within that, then we do measure where people were born, so we do record that. So we have the Irish-born population. It was close to the what we would expect, so about 20% of the population who were born abroad. Now, once you get into that born abroad category, getting representativeness of the people who are born abroad is going to get much more difficult because the sample size becomes much smaller. The other point to note is that obviously in order to do the study, you need to have access to the internet and a level of English that allows you to take part in these types of surveys. So we are not going to be representative of people who say, for example, might have unmet English language needs. By and large, we didn't see large differences between people who were born abroad and the Irish population on many of the measures. Mostly, in fact, the sociodemographic differences between different groups. You might expect there to be more of these differences, but they were by and large quite small. Yeah, quite consistent across the across different subgroups of the population.
Is somewhat related to that, but more on the Irish population, maybe particularly. A question from Philpon. Did you collect any information on the respondents' sort of personal experience of immigration, particularly, if Irish people had immigrated themselves and returned, did they have different attitudes to migration than those who had never been abroad?
So this is it's something we did a kind of an exploratory analysis on. So we included a question. This doesn't feature in the report, but we did include a question on whether people who maybe had a family member who emigrated and they were now living in Ireland. So in order to take part in the country, you needed to be in the survey. You need to be resident in Ireland. So we had a few kind of exploratory measures in there, and they didn't necessarily seem to be predictive of misperceptions or indeed of attitudes.
Okay. And on that very big difference in the estimates of social housing versus the kind of the real numbers, both for Irish and for migrants, did you include HAP tenancies in that? And could there just be perhaps a bit of a misperception in what the question itself was trying to collect?
Yeah, so this is something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about since getting since seeing the results, because obviously it's a much larger overestimate of social housing uptake. We defined social housing just as social housing to people. So for both questions, you kind of could interpret social housing as what you understand it to be. We have then since obviously regretted that decision. We would have liked to give it a more concrete definition of it to make sure that people weren't misinterpreting it. But hindsight bias is a great one. But we've since, and we do touch on this in the report, we have looked at what the accurate or official statistics would be if you incorporate HAP and if you incorporate all of the other kind of potential forms of social housing, and you don't come close to the kind of estimate that we have. So it isn't a third of the population who are in just any form of broadly defined social housing. So it does seem to be that there's just an overestimate of it. In fact, I think some of our co-authors have gone around to kind of friends and family asking them to just guess, okay, so what's going on here? How many are in social housing? And you do tend to get that sort of 30 to 40% estimate. So it's just kind of it's a funny one.
Okay. And then a sort of a more broader question on the overall kind of area of the report is, what does it really mean that misperceptions are systematically biased?
Yeah, thank you. So that's a clarification point needed on my part. So by systematically there, I'm referring to essentially they're biased in line with that intergroup threat theory. So it's not the case that you have, say, what perception of one immigration fact is kind of biased upwards, so that there are perhaps more in employment, and then also overestimating the tertiary education levels. Everything seems to be kind of going in line with what you might expect from intergroup threat theory, where it's less in employment, less skilled, more taking social welfare, more criminality, and so on. So it seems to be systematically biased in line with intergroup threat theory. But thanks for the clarification.
Okay. In terms then, another clarification question coming in on those kind of free text boxes where people were asked about just the big issues facing the country at the moment. In terms of the amount of detail people typed in, is there a little bit of a risk perhaps that the immigration and anti-immigration sentiment could have some slightly overlapping concerns, or were they all kind of clearly demarcated that immigration meant concerns about the risks, or was that hard to say in some cases?
Yeah, good question there. So this is something again, it's a footnote in the report. But what we have done there is that if you mention immigration, we class you as kind of citing immigration as a national issue. If you both mentioned immigration in the open text and reported a negative attitude towards it. So that 27% or so, they both cited immigration and have a negative attitude towards it. If you said immigration, but you feel positively towards it, you might then think, okay, that might be concerns about anti-immigration sentiment. The vast majority of the anti-immigration sentiment, however, that was very specifically stating something like anti-immigration sentiment or protests against immigration as a sort of national issue. So yeah, we were careful there because obviously if someone just types in immigration, you might not necessarily know what it is that they're saying. So we were careful there to try to ensure that if we're counting immigration as a sort of negative attitude in that question, it's you have a negative attitude and have said immigration in the open text.
Okay, and we've got a couple of, I think this is very interesting sort of questions, so maybe be a bit beyond the scope of the study, but people asking, did you get any sense from in terms of where people were getting their information, their misperceptions for? Was there anything on, say, social media as opposed to traditional media, where people were getting the kind of the firm information for the guesses? Or was
Yeah, so that's obviously it's one of the big questions now following on from this is okay, well, what is causing these misperceptions? So we can't necessarily be sure of what's causing it. It would be consistent with getting information or some kind of attention that is drawn to certain subgroups in national media or on social media, for example. In this particular study and in this report, we don't report on where people are getting their information from, but we do hope to do work on that. Hopefully, this year we'll be able to do some work on the relationship between the misperceptions you hold and where you get your current affairs information from, be that different types of traditional media, online media, social media, and so on. So that's a kind of to be continued answer, I'm afraid.
yeah. And then a bit more in terms of perhaps areas where you'd like to do further work on the different impacts on the frequency of connection. It's kind of interesting that a lot of previous research had said just having interaction with migrants would improve general perceptions and attitudes, whereas your finding is a lot more nuanced than that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is. I mean, previously the idea, so it's intergroup contact theory is the one that kind of people usually point towards, which originally said the kind of more contact you have with migrants, the more likely it is that you will form a positive attitude towards them. There is increasing recognition kind of more recently that it's the quality of that interaction that matters, not just the fact that you have it. And that's certainly what we find support for here. Now, it is a difficult one to, again, identify causality on. So we find that if you have a personal connection, more frequent contact is associated with more positive attitude. If you don't have a personal connection, then more positive or more frequent contact is associated with a negative attitude. But of course, it could be the case that if you have a positive attitude and you have frequent contact, you might be more likely to form a personal connection. So again, this is a kind of possibly a springboard for kind of further research on really trying to understand and unpick that. But it certainly would imply that integration efforts would want to kind of take into consideration that quality of contact, not just the frequency of it.
Yeah. Um, Question here then, I guess, on our own past work in terms of, is there any evidence that the kind of attitudes to migration have changed over time? Obviously, we've had a large surge in the number of migrants, but do we have anything to suggest that that has come with changing attitudes?
So I might throw this to Kira, but my understanding anyway from when the exact same question is measured over time. In general, the trend is more positive. There was a slight dip in the last couple of years in it, but it still remains more positive than it had previously. In our study, we didn't necessarily ask the exact same question that's been asked before, and that's because we were doing that. Our main priority was that link to misperceptions rather than doing the tracking over time. Our findings are still consistent with that idea that they remain positive, perhaps with a slight dip. But yeah, I see Kira's coming in here. Nice and bright.
Yeah, sorry, the sun is right in my face. So I suppose there's two different answers, and one is on salience and one is on attitudes. So the overall attitudes, part of the story is that they crashed so badly during the recession, that there's been this kind of positive trend since. There's been a dip in the last few years, but from a really historic high point. And I suppose the other point is that in a European context, they're very high. On the other hand, salience tells a very different story. So this is basically people citing it as one of the top two issues facing the country, and that's higher now than it has been at any point in Irish history.
Thanks, Kira.
Okay, and let me just take a look so as not to kind of repeat questions. One interesting one here is on the question on the prison population as opposed to on crime or criminality more broadly. And they're kind of motivated here in terms of coverage in the US, where people from sort of Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups are perhaps more likely to be part of you know, the prison population, and questions on the equity of treatment there perhaps as much as the kind of causing of crime itself.
Yes, that's a really, really good question. One that we considered as well when designing the types of questions that we would ask. I should say that when we were designing the questions, there was a couple of things that we prioritized. The first one being that participants would be able to understand the question that is being asked. And then the second one is that we would have official estimates that we could benchmark their guesses to. And it's that second reason is why we went with the prison population. So there, we had stats on not the birthplace of the prison population, but their nationality. And so that's why we included that question. We don't have official stats essentially on crime rates among different either nationalities or where people might have been born and so on. So that's the reason for it. But I do take the point. Yeah, it's an important one.
And then kind of in terms of taking the findings of this maybe forward a little bit, we've got two or three comments coming in asking about sort of the role of policy or what this means for addressing these misperceptions and what could be done to kind of is it all bias, or what could be done to kind of address the sources of bias there?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. So as we kind of point out in the report, it's difficult to identify exactly what the causes of these misperceptions are, which means it might be then difficult to address them. Some good news, I guess, is that we do see those accurate perceptions of things like the percentage of residence applications from Ukraine, as well as perceptions of Irish employment rates and so on. So it's not necessarily impossible for people to hold accurate perceptions of these economic and social facts. But perhaps they need to be kind of communicated more regularly with the sort of reliable data that's needed. So kind of highlighting now that we've identified the kind of misperceptions that people hold, it provides evidence for the kinds of things that are under-recognized. That being things like the migrant employment rate, education levels, that people tend to be overestimating international protection applications, for example. So there's certainly kind of facts that we've identified that people are not recognizing. That could be a target for communication. But I'm not a communications expert. So it's as a behavioral scientist, it opens up really interesting questions for, okay, what is the best way to then kind of correct these misperceptions? There's some suggestive evidence that, and you might buy this, that just presenting people with stats isn't necessarily going to fix things. That other kind of methods might be needed. But yeah, that's an open question, unfortunately, but very willing to do some work on it.
Yeah. And obviously, I mean, you went through the findings of the report kind of reasonably quickly there, and I'd encourage everybody to look at the full report, which is on our website, and it may answer a couple of these questions. There are some people asking about sort of specific characteristics of the respondents and how they correspond, maybe both to the attitudes and the misperceptions. In particular, are differences across sort of urban, rural, and age cohorts, as well as education levels. So maybe you might give a just a minute of bit more detail on those different kind of like other socioeconomic characteristics and how they fed into the results.
Sure, yeah, we have a couple of tables in the report. I think one of them might be in the appendix, so if someone is very eager, that looks at those specifically. I would start off this response by saying that actually the sociodemographic predictors of both attitudes and immigration appear to matter less than these kind of psychological predictors. So things like misperceptions, that they seem to matter more. A couple of things that emerged in it. So we do see some differences between men and women in terms of both attitudes and in misperceptions, which I'll try to be careful in explaining it because it might sound counterintuitive. So men tended to be slightly more accurate than women in their misperceptions, but also hold more negative attitudes. Now, that might sound like it goes against what I've just said about misperceptions and attitudes, but essentially, men were shifted down on both scales. So they were less likely to overestimate things like the number of migrants living in the country, but then that their overestimate was still linked with a negative attitude than women in it. We also see differences in attitudes by age group where the youngest age group, so those under 40, and the older age group, those over 60, have more positive attitudes than the middle age group. And that is something that is consistent with other work we've done, for example, in the climate space, for example. So the middle age group tend to hold more negative attitudes on these types of issues. And then we also found effects on educational attainment. So those with a tertiary education tended to have more positive attitudes towards immigration. I would caveat that by flagging work that has been led by a colleague, Fran McGinnity, showing that people with higher levels of education are more likely to just mask negative attitudes in surveys. So this might not be a real effect, it might be kind of social liability coming through, despite the efforts that we put in there. And people with higher education were also a bit more accurate when it came to the misperceptions. We don't see very much variation and no significant variation by kind of urban, rural, or the region people live in. We haven't gone to the same granularity that Kira and Co. Did in their kind of community level drivers of attitudes, but looking at urban, rural, and regional effects, we really don't see much going on there.
Okay, and this next question is perhaps almost a little bit more for Kira and some previous work, which is on the impacts on negative perceptions from living in a kind of a more deprived area or areas where there might be a perceived strain on local infrastructure. And that's something we actually maybe was a little bit, it was one of the variables in this report, but it was touched on in a lot more detail in previous work.
Yeah, so we've done two pieces of previous work that can give insight into this. So one, I think Shane mentioned in quite a bit of depth. So it was on the individual level factors. So on an individual level, things like financial strain, feeling that your life was better in the past, or feeling optimistic towards the future, all impacted on attitudes, kind of in the directions you'd expect. But then we went further and we looked at these community level factors. So does living in kind of a disadvantaged community, we used kind of the normal kind of indices of disadvantage affect your attitudes. And we found that it did, especially when there had been a recent increase in immigration. And the impact was quite large. I don't think Shane compared it here because the methodologies were so different when they didn't have the data, but it was a relatively large impact of living in a disadvantaged community. And that's independent kind of controlling for your individual situation and factors, which was really interesting.
Okay, and I guess in terms of just linking back, Shane, there to your point about that people might give, accept what they perceive to be acceptable answers. One question here on, did the participants really know about the purpose of the research before they started?
Yeah, so this is an interesting issue. So in order to prevent people from being more likely to take part or not take part in the study because it's about immigration, so you can imagine someone who has strong views being more willing to take part if they know the study is about immigration. The initial kind of invite and information to people was that it was about issues in society in general, and that was true for the first few measures. So we had that policy attitudes, the list of policies, so they were about various different issues in society, and that open text question we elicited people's kind of what they thought were the main issues facing Ireland at the moment. The study then moved on, and we were clear with people that the next phase of the study is going to be about immigration specifically, and that's when we were measuring perceptions. We then want to check if people are more likely to exit the study at that stage. So that would give us an indication that you have what we call selection effect. So people staying in it because it's about immigration. But we had very, very few people. I think it was less than 10 people who exited once they learned that the study was about immigration. So we didn't want to invite people in who had strong attitudes either way to try to be as representative as possible. And then, yeah, it was revealed to them throughout the study that the second half of it was the part that was about immigration specifically.
Okay, and just focusing in again on one of the particular kind of areas where you might expect there to be a sort of predictive value, but you kind of didn't find so much, was on the left to right political persuasion point, and maybe asking to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yes, so we did rely on the kind of standard measure that's used. So you give yourself a rating between 0 and 10, 0 being left and 10 being right. In that we did see a difference there by political orientation, even when you control for the other factors. But as one of the last charts that I showed there, that was generally in line with other psychological characteristics, so how much you trust other people and so on, in terms of the size of the effect, the size of that difference that made. But some of the perception measures mattered more than that political orientation measure. But as you might expect, there are correlations between those. The other point on that that's probably worth making is that this political orientation being predictive of attitudes towards kind of social policy and so on is something in Ireland that has only emerged in the last few years. So in previous reports that have kind of measured it, measured political orientation and looked at the relationship between attitudes, there's no relationship between it. It's really only over the last couple of years that we see this sort of political orientation variable being predictive of attitudes.
Okay, and then we've got one or two sort of more technical questions on if you looked at kind of other ways of estimating, like kind of cluster analysis, and if that might be helpful, not in a technical term, but in terms of sort of targeting particular groups for campaigns that would lower the incidence of either misperceptions or that lower the incidence of negative attitudes. And sort of related to that, on the kind of the migrants themselves, if there were anything you could say there on particular subgroups that were most at risk or had any experience of negative attitudes or negative behaviors. Again,
Mhm.
maybe those are somewhat beyond the scope of this particular piece of research, but certainly giving us some ideas as well about, for further avenues of research.
Yeah, so the cluster analysis point is interesting. I smiled a bit there when I saw the cluster analysis because it is something we're working on for another project that is to do with how people think about climate policy and the economy and so on. So we're working on cluster analysis there, and it has proved to be less than straightforward to identify kind of clean clusters of individuals. I wouldn't be terribly hopeful for it in this, particularly because we just see so little influence from socio-demographic variables. Obviously, it's potentially there. I think what might be more fruitful is that kind of piece of work trying to identify where these misperceptions might be coming from in terms of the information channels, for example, that an information channel could be targeted rather than targeting to sociodemographic subgroups. And then the second part of that question was about the characteristics of the individuals and if they've experienced possibly anti-immigrant sentiment. We don't explore that in the report. But we do point out that there is, I guess, there is a case for more good quality data on that. So we do kind of reference the rise in hate crimes that have been reported to the Gardaí, obviously acknowledging that that is likely to be underreported. And then we do point out that it would be beneficial to have a kind of tracking survey or some sort of survey on the experience of people who are on the receiving end of that, but no, not within the scope of this report, unfortunately.
Okay. Let me just a couple of questions mentioning Northern Ireland, of course, which wasn't covered by the report, but I think is an area of kind of other research interest within the ESRI. So hopefully we might get to that at another point. Um, and then one kind of maybe slightly more specific question on the use of online surveys and if there is an issue there in terms of selection and maybe particularly in terms of targeting people who are less digitally literate.
Yeah, good question. It's one that we obviously think about quite a lot. In general, it's quite difficult to run any sort of survey where you're not going to have some form of selection effect because the people who are going to say yes to taking part in a survey might differ from people who are going to say no to taking part in a survey. So that's why we do a lot of work to see if we can benchmark the kinds of responses we're getting in our survey to other studies that have been run using other methods. So something that's quite reassuring here, for example, is that the proportion of people who mentioned immigration as an issue matches other studies that have used different sampling frames. So we're kind of you become reasonably confident then that you're kind of being more representative of what the public think. But we do acknowledge that if you do not have the sort of digital literacy to be taking part in an online survey, you're not going to be represented in this one. Now, I would say that the level of internet kind of penetration in Ireland is at a level where it's reasonably broad. It's quite a large proportion of the population who have it. That said, the report wouldn't necessarily be representative of people who are above the age of 80, for example. We have very few people, I think we might have some people up to the age of 85 in the study, but beyond that, we don't have very many respondents from it. So we do point out in the report the limitations of the method that we've used. Unfortunately, other surveys that try to do things like door-to-door sampling, for example, that tends to lose out on people who might live in apartment blocks because they're much harder to get to their door, or random digit dialing has become much harder because lots of people don't want to answer the phone anymore to random numbers. So really, it's quite difficult to run these. We think that going online for a kind of more sensitive topic like immigration, from our perspective, I think is probably one of the more beneficial ones because it reduces that social desirability bias and it doesn't have some of those issues despite it having that digital literacy element. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess in that, kind of related to the point of what might affect people's answers and social desirability, there's another question on just the ordering of the survey and whether people got the stylized facts or the attitudes first, and if that could make a difference. And then, kind of a little bit related, if there was any questions or anything you could say on what might change people's responses. Were people given any kind of options to say what would make their perceptions more positive? Or...
Interesting. Okay. I will take the first one first because that one is much easier for me to answer. So yes, we were very conscious of the order in which people were going to do these questions. So very deliberately, the first question people are asked was that open text question before you were primed by anything else in the study. So that open text, what are the main issues facing the country? You saw nothing else. No other questions came before that. We then presented people with so those questions about their political outlook and so on, the questions about their household finances, and their questions about general kind of policy attitudes. They were in three separate bundles and presented in random order, and then we checked, okay, does the order matter? And the order didn't matter there. And then the final section for people was that section on their perceptions. So what that means is that we didn't ask people about, for example, the employment rate among migrants, and then follow up and ask them what they think about immigration. So you weren't primed to think about the employment rate when answering your attitudes. You answered the attitudes first, and that was very deliberate. So there's certainly the perception, asking the perception questions essentially couldn't have influenced attitudes in the way that we've designed it. In terms of the second one, in terms of what might change people's perceptions or attitudes, we didn't ask people essentially what might change them. So that does feed into that issue around how to correct possible misperceptions that people have, and a bigger question then on whether correcting misperceptions has any influence on attitudes, or might they be being caused by something that is completely separate. So that's a much harder question to ask, or to answer, I should say. Easy to ask.
Okay. Um, in terms of another interesting one here, when you looked at the count of the number of misperceptions and how that impacted people's attitudes, it rather than being a sort of a smooth shift downwards, it was very much concentrated in a jump in the very negative attitude. I wonder if you'd any kind of thoughts on that, and if that information could be sort of useful again in kind of helping correct any misperceptions.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So I'm taking that this is from the chart where I showed having two misperceptions versus
Mm.
four, and you see that the jump in the one. It is actually quite linear if we look at the difference between misperceptions, one misperception, two, and so on. So I selected two and four there, sort of. The most people held essentially most of the sample was between two and four misperceptions. So I chose two as, okay, this is the kind of the lower end of the scale for most people, and four being the upper end of the scale for most people. And that's why I kind of presented those. But really the effect is a bit more linear, that the more of these misperceptions you have, essentially, the more
Mm.
likely it is you hold a negative attitude towards immigration.
Okay, there's a couple of more then on that point on the level of contact and the type of contact. It seems that'd be certainly something that would be interesting to delve into a little bit more. But I guess the particular, in a short survey, there's only so much information you can get on that. Um, but it's certainly an issue that is coming up kind of several times in the questions, and possibly an area where you know policy could play some piece of a role in terms of kind of promoting more constructive interactions.
Yeah, so we did actually. So one of the questions that doesn't feature in the report is because the report itself is focused on the misperceptions and attitudes, and then we included the contact questions as sort of this is what's shown to be predictive. But one of our colleagues, Fran McGinnity, managed to convince us to add in another question to the survey on the nature of the contact. Now, nothing has been done with that data yet, but in terms of whether people are having contact at the workplace, in shops, and so on. So there is some data that we have there that we could maybe exploit at a later stage to try to unpick that further now that we have this kind of nuanced finding. Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned the importance of the framing effects in terms of the location of the migrants. And there's a question here on was there any sort of framing effects tested on other specific measures like education to try and ask, had they low education as opposed to tertiary education, I guess is the point there.
Yeah, good. That's a really good question. So we focused on the location of migrants for it. We also asked, so one of the other frames that we did was about the gender of migrants. So we asked if how many male migrants were born, or how much of the population were born abroad and are men, for example, or versus born abroad and are women. And we see the exact same framing effect there, where the group that was drawn attention to, people tend to think that that group is larger than the group that wasn't kind of mentioned in the question. So we do see some consistency there. We didn't use it on every question, and some of that, if without getting into the technicalities of it, essentially you're kind of worried about the sample sizes getting too small if you see lots of these different effects of people answering in different ways. But I would, yeah, probably hypothesize as a behavioral scientist that you'd see the effect on other questions too.
Okay, there's a couple of questions on the policy issues, which I think I'd point people towards the Department of Justice's page and their policy documents there rather than ESRI research. But more, maybe as a final question, a much more broad behavioral scientist question, which is could you say anything about the causal pathways from attitudes and emotional responses to cognitive estimates and vice versa? So a little bit of a can we say anything about the direction of causation, either in this specific instance or in sort of behavioral science findings more broadly?
Yeah, really, really good question, and great that we're going to end on an easy one. Thanks, Martina. Yeah, no, really, really good question. We do touch on that issue quite a lot in the report. We dedicate a kind of full section to it. So we are clear in the report that we cannot be certain of causality here. So it could be the case that people who hold negative attitudes want to then justify them by reporting or holding these sorts of misperceptions about migrants, or holding these misperceptions are then causing you to have a negative attitude. It could be a bit of both, and there could be some circularity in it, or they could both be being caused by something else. So they could both be being caused by where you're getting your information from that's leading to misperceptions and leading to attitudes separately. So lots of different possibilities in here, difficult to disentangle them, particularly using sorts of survey data. It'd be very even difficult to run experiments on it. What we do talk about in the report is the data we have not being consistent with certain types of explanations. So, for example, there is some literature suggests that misperceptions are caused by what we see day to day. And so, for example, you might overestimate the share of migrants in the population if you are seeing them more often. So, for example, if you're more likely to see migrants working in shops and restaurants, for example, the migrants tend to be younger, that might lead you to overestimate how many migrants are in the population, and that might be causing that misperception. But the issue with our data is that we also see misperceptions of the prison population and in the social housing uptake, and that's not something that you can necessarily see. So we don't think it can be explained by that. Um, we also, given the kind of ordering of the questions that we asked and so on, we don't think it can be explained fully by that kind of motivated reasoning account either. Instead, that question or that finding the framing effect, whereby drawing attention to a specific group leads people to overestimate the size of that group, we think that might be the likely kind of causal explanation for it. But we're very cautious in that language in the report, which I appreciate can frustrate some people, as researchers will be cautious with that. But given the evidence that we have now, I think that's the most likely explanation. But we couldn't really go further with that at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much, Shane. We're a few minutes ahead of time, but I think you've been asked a lot of questions and done an excellent job in presenting the findings of the research and engaging with all of the different comments. Thanks to all of the other authors on the report, of course, and also to the Department of Justice, Home Affairs and Migration for their involvement in the research programme. The full report and all of the other reports on issues of migration and integration that have been undertaken as part of this program are all available on the ESRI's website, which is at the very easy www.esri.ie if people want to dig into a bit more detail. Thanks to everybody for attending, and I hope to see you again at another ESRI event soon. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.